welcome back everybody to another episode of ITProTV. I'm your host, Don Pezet, and we are here today to jump right back into CompTIA IT Fundamentals. In this episode specifically, we're going to be taking a look at storage hardware, which for me is the one that I'm always running out of. I can never have enough of. So we're going to take a look at the different types of storage and some of the other things that are going on. And here to help us is Mr. Ronnie Wong. Ronnie, thanks for joining us.
Well, Don, thank you for having me on the show as we continue to take a look at the idea of computer hardware, especially this idea of storage. And I think you make a telling statement. The very fact is when we start talking about storage, we're always running out of storage. Today, even more than ever. At one point, Don, I don't know about you, but I remember my very first hard drive that I ever bought on my own. Not the one that my parents bought, but the one that I bought on my own. It was a 20 megabyte hard drive, and I was king of the world because that was like 6 times bigger than anything else that was ever out there before that. But yes, the idea of capacity at that point, it was actually the biggest one that I had in college, and it was actually the biggest one on my little tiny college campus that I was there on until somebody else bought a 40 megabyte one. But overall though, capacity I think is the key when we start talking about the idea of storage. But there's also different types of storage that we want to get into, as well as talking about some of the ones that we tend to encounter on a daily basis that we might not think are also storage devices too, which will of course make sure that you actually see that and show you how some of that actually, converts into the idea of capacity for us and what it does for us in terms of our computer state.
All right, well, Ronnie, you make some really good points there. Like when I hear the word storage, I immediately think hard drives, right? And I am constantly running out of hard drive space on my systems. So that's kind of what pops into my mind. But really, hard drives are just a type of memory, and there's more than one type of memory in a computer. So let's start off right there with, what are some of the different kinds of memory, and which type are we going to be talking about in this episode?
Yeah, that's a great point to make, Don. The idea here behind memory is when our computers need to be able to do something, it doesn't just take it directly from the hard drive and use it. It has to be able to use it much quicker than what the hard drive can provide. So we tend to also have to put it in some type of memory that the processor will be able to access very quickly as well. So there's another type of memory for us that's really a lot faster than the idea of what we call our traditional hard drives here, okay? When we start talking about that, you hear it in very general, broad categorical terms too. So one term is what we call volatile memory, okay? Volatile memory means that it will keep whatever data that we store on that chip, and that's what it tends to run on is computer chips here. It will keep that pattern of whatever data that we send to it as long as there is electricity available to keep it there. Now, once we turn the machine off, that pattern dissipates, it goes away, and then if the machine reboots, it's completely gone at that point. So as long as there's electricity present, then it will keep whatever we have in there. Now, that works because there's a lot of times where we don't need everything to be there permanently. We just need to be able to use that space as a workspace so that our computers can do whatever it needs to do. And then from that point, if it needs more information, well, it can get rid of some of the information and then bring new information into that workspace. But then there's also what we call non-volatile memory as well. And in non-volatile memory, that really means that if the computer itself loses its electricity, the information that we originally had stored on it is not going to go away. It's going to stay there regardless of whether or not there's electricity present. So when you hear about them in the context of the computer, there's really 2 types of those memories that we're talking about. So the first one, volatile, is represented by what we call RAM, okay? And RAM, here's a stick of RAM that I have available. As long as this piece of RAM here connected to the motherboard has electricity going on it, well, those chips that are on this little circuit board that we have, well, they'll keep the information on there and available for access and whatever we actually need to it. Once the information goes, or once the electricity goes away, well, then the information will kind of dissipate off of that as well. Now, there's also other chips on the motherboard too that we can talk about as well, which don't require information, or not information, don't require electricity. It has to require information. So we have things that the computer needs for the computer to be able to boot up and recognize all the devices. And when you hear about that, you might hear about the idea of what we call read-only memory. And that's just information that was programmed in from the factory that's going to be there, regardless of whether or not I have electricity given to it as well. Now, from that point, well, we tend to be able to use that when the computer is doing what it needs to. But if we're sending data, that is when we probably go to more non-volatile in this sense as well. Now, it needs electricity to write information to a device like this, but it doesn't need electricity to store the information. It will actually store the information on a physical location. There's actually platters here, which will allow it to write information to it, and it will store it. And if I turn the computer off and turn it back on, the information is still accessible on this device as well. So those are really the two broad categories of memory types that we tend to find in our computer systems.
So to kind of reinforce that, Ronnie, you were holding up the storage, right? So the RAM that you were holding up, since it's not plugged into a computer, it doesn't have electricity, so it's effectively empty, right? There's no data on that. If I were to stick that in my computer, it's empty. That's how it's going to be. But the hard drive you held up, that's been pulled out of a computer, it has no power, but the data on it's still safe, right? It's probably worth mentioning that it's not 100% safe. There are things that could damage the data that are on there, so we don't want to necessarily do it like we're doing here on the show, and handle equipment more than we need to. But the reasoning here is that data is stored a good bit different on our non-volatile storage. I always remember, like when I got started in computing, they would always tell you, keep magnets away from the computers, right? Don't get magnets anywhere near your computer. Magnets wouldn't do physical damage, but they could actually damage the data that was stored on your drive. So kind of an interesting way of remembering this is kind of like short-term memory and long-term memory in a human, that there's things that we just need to remember for a little while, and there's things that we need to remember for a long time. So we have different types of storage. Now, whenever we talk about storage, whether it's RAM or whether it's a physical hard drive like you held up, one of the big concerns is how much we have, right? And when I go to buy a computer, they always advertise it really clearly. It comes with this much RAM and this big of a hard drive, or this much other storage. Sometimes they don't denote it very well, and they just say it has memory in a certain amount, and that doesn't necessarily let you know is that RAM or storage. But let's talk a little bit about how that size is measured, right? What are some of the units of measurement that we encounter?
Yeah, when it comes down to actually buying storage or needing storage for your computers, and you're starting to look at purchasing this, well, you're going to look for two different types, right? You're going to look for RAM, or you're going to also look for a hard drive or some type of storage capacity too. And that measurement is done in terms of what we call bytes, okay, of information. And today, there are multiples of those bytes as well. So let's take a look at my screen, and this should help us to kind of make sure that we understand. At least I hope that. Let me see if I can center some of this stuff out as we start to talk about. When it comes down to capacity, remember that when we start talking about the information itself, computers don't know about alphabets and different things. What it knows about are ones and zeros in terms of what the computer can process and do. So when we start doing that, we're working with information that's either going to be a 1 or a 0 and a pattern of 1 or zeros. Well, that begins with a single bit, and that means a 1 or a 0 is actually what is represented at this point. Now, when we start to work in this idea of storage as well, 8 bits together combine, and it forms what we call the idea of a byte of information. Now, a byte of information is 8 bits, which is fine. That's another category, and that's larger, of course, than just a bit. But then we go into the kilobytes of information, and this is equal to 1,000 bytes, okay, of information. Now, the hard drive that I was talking about right at the beginning of the show, the 20 megabyte hard drive, well, that was essentially 20 of these kilobits here, right? 20,000 of these kilobits is what it was actually coming out to be, right? So a megabyte is equatable to 1,000 of these kilobytes, or equal to 1,000,000 bytes as we start to take a look, okay? So you'll notice that there are multiples as they continue to jump up here. But Don, when was the last time you bought a hard drive that was in megabyte size?
It's been a long time, and I think I was in college because I'm a little bit younger than you are, Ronnie, and I bought a 950 megabyte drive that was, like your story, was way bigger than anybody else's at the time. Now we kind of laugh about that because it's not even 1 gigabyte. So today it's almost entirely gigabytes.
Yeah, it's amazing because when I first bought that hard drive, it was so big. Okay, that 20 megabyte hard drive, it felt like it was a little bit smaller than a shoebox at that point, but that was its capacity that it could actually end up holding. So 20 megabytes here is relatively small today, but in that day it was actually large. Today we tend to see, of course, the idea of gigabytes and terabytes. Now remember that when we start moving up here, right? Well, a gigabyte is about 1,000 megabytes. So notice it's actually multiplied that again. Or if you want to go back to the term bytes here, about 1 billion bytes. And a terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. Or if you want to come down to that, look at that. That's, I don't even know what number that is. Beyond billion, that is trillion. So that is 1 trillion bytes. And then even sizes that are bigger than what we'll actually have in a regular desktop computer, at least I think at this point, which is a petabyte, which is equal to about 1,000 terabytes. So when we're recording the show today, the ideas of about 500 megabyte hard drives are probably fairly standard on a lot of devices, or 256, not megabytes, gigabytes, excuse me, gigabytes, and 500 gigabytes is fairly standard, and terabytes, of course, are becoming even more standard as well, okay, when we start seeing it. But now you're starting to see, of course, not only is this actually the truth when we're heading into the terabyte world, what Don was mentioning is that when you start buying them, you'll see, for example, on the actual drive itself, there's going to be a label on here that will tell you what size this drive is, okay? So on the label, you'll see, and on the box, if you happen to buy a physical one, it will also tell you. But this one says 3,000 gigabytes. Now, they could have actually just abbreviated that as being 3 terabytes if they wanted to, but this one actually does say 3,000 gigabytes here. That shows you the capacity that we can store on here, which is so much more than what we can believe here, because that's 3 trillion bytes of information, which is a lot of information. Now, Don, though, this one is a physical hard drive, and that's something else we want to talk about as well. The very fact is that means that there's a platter inside, and you can kind of see the outline of that kind of roundness here too. But it means that the data is actually stored on physical locations on that drive as well. Okay, and that's what we want to make sure that we understand.
And with a physical disk like that, it's older technology, right? Because these have been around since the late 1980s. I mean, obviously, it's if you compare today's spinning hard disk to one from the 1980s, it is a world of difference. Right. But it is still the same basic idea. There's a physical platter that's spinning inside of it, and it's got certain limitations. So, for example, Ronnie pointed out that one has 3,000 gigabytes of storage. But I can guarantee you, if I put that in my computer and I format it and I set it up, I'll end up with a partition size that's probably more like not 3 terabytes, but more like 2.7 terabytes or something. You lose some of the storage. Because of the way that the binary ones and zeros have to get stored on this physical platter, you actually lose some of that overhead. And that's kind of the nature of the beast with that type of storage. Now, that's old technology, right, which implies that there must be something new, right, Ronnie? Right. Something that gets in and kind of solves the problems of physical disks?
Yeah, when it comes down to it, the physical disk also, not only because of the losing of the storage sometimes, but because also it's physical, it means that it has to kind of rotate that disk to find the information, which also means it's going to be slower. So by comparison, even though I might have a disk like this, that will still work, it will still function the way that we want to, but we can only spin that disk so fast to access the information too. Well, now we can change that, and we can actually come up with something, well, much smaller. So I know it's hard to see with my black shirt on and everything, but you can now see in comparison here the thickness of this device versus this one. And that is because with this one, which is a newer technology, okay, this one there's no moving parts, Don. And without moving parts, it means it can access it all electronically, which is going to be much faster than what we had before. This one does not have as much capacity, but it's close. Don, what size do you think that this particular drive is?
It's got to be, it has to be cheap enough for us to use it on the show. So I'm going to guess that it's about a 256 gig.
Well, you would think so, but if I turn this thing over, right, it actually is
a full terabyte. Wow.
Yeah, it's a terabyte solid state, and that's what they call this. It's called solid state drive here. And so this one is a terabyte, and you can kind of almost see the little TB there. But overall, though, so the capacity, even though the size is smaller physically here, capacity, we can get these much bigger, but it becomes much more expensive too.
And what you're holding up is it's a little misleading too, because like when Ronnie holds up that physical spinning disk, all right, the size of that disk has to be that size because there are platters inside of it that fill up that space. I mean, that's why the disk is that size. The one that's in his left hand, though, it's actually in a case. And the case is somewhat fake. If we were to crack that open, which it's expensive, so we're not going to do that. But if we were to crack that open, the actual memory inside of it fills up less than half of that case. And the reason they put a bigger case on there is so that it's the same size as laptop style hard drives, the older technology. They didn't want to
form
have
factor.
to. They didn't want to re-update all the form factor of laptops and other things to take account for this new storage. Now, we're not seeing that on the newest equipment. If you're buying laptops today, they may not even take into account the size of old laptop hard drives, and they shift to newer stuff. Do you have an example of that, Ronnie?
We do. So just like what Don was talking about, right? So here's what I have available to me in this, size as well.
The traditional form
The
factor.
traditional form factor. But Don, this one right here is also a hard drive as well. And this is confusing for most people because it looks fairly similar to what I held up a little bit earlier, which was a a volatile memory, which is RAM. So this is got chips on it too. And this one, of course, has chips. But this one is actually going to be smaller, but also faster, and it directly connects into the motherboard too. So this one actually has a little card that does it. But overall, though, this one has a capacity, I believe, of 250 gigabytes on this one, and it is a faster drive for us as well. So not only are we starting to see the form factor change and no longer follow those rules like what Don was talking about, but we're now starting to see that we can start putting more and more information on it, even in smaller sizes as well. And so you're starting to see more of these because it's very lightweight. And not only that, though, it fits in, well, just about everything. So not only will this fit into a regular desktop computer, which this one was actually put into, but it can also fit into something such as my, laptop as well. And then I have the same capacity, but not needing the additional space to make a gigantic laptop work and have the same capacities that are out there too. So this is what you're starting to see more and more, and there's a couple of different varieties of these, but overall though, okay, you're starting to see more of this type of storage as well. So all these are actually coming into, the idea of the capacities that we need to work, and you're starting to see more of that because, the form factors are changing as well.
Now, I'll tell you, you may hear me complain from time to time that computing technology hasn't changed all that much in the last 10 years, that we haven't seen groundbreaking advancements in CPUs. We haven't seen amazing networking technologies come out. The things have been slow increments, right? Processors have gotten incrementally faster. Networks have gotten incrementally faster. But storage is a big area of improvement. When we go from a traditional spinning disk to flash-based memory, like the SSD that Ronnie was holding up, they are so much faster, light years faster than what we had on spinning disks. That's one big improvement, but I'll tell you the biggest improvement, in my opinion, anytime you have a moving part, it can wear out, right? Fans wear out, hard drives wear out. They have an arm, and then there's moving back and forth thousands of times a second sometimes. Like, they wear out. A lot of us have experienced hard drive failures at some point or another. In fact, it's a rare hard drive that lasts beyond 3 years. That's usually the window they're willing to warranty them. Anytime you get beyond 3 years is like a bonus time, right? But flash memory, like the SSD that Ronnie held up, those are super fast with no moving parts. That means they're far less likely to have a failure, and they last significantly longer. Now, when the initial ones came out, they did have a limit to the amount of times you can read and write to them before they wore out. That technology has been advanced, though, and we don't really have those limits anymore. Right. And so now this storage is so much better that if I take, let's say you have a computer that's got a 3.4 gigahertz processor, and I give you a computer with a 3.6 gigahertz processor, you probably won't notice the difference. If you had 4 cores in your processor and I give you one with 8 cores, you probably won't notice the difference. But if you have a computer with a spinning disk and you move to SSD, you will notice big time. It is a huge advancement. So it's one of the most exciting advancements we've seen in computers these days.
There's no doubt, Don, that what you say, I've experienced the same thing too. And I don't think you experience the speed in the same way, which is weird. Just like what Don was saying, that when you experience that, sometimes you don't even realize how fast it is by comparison until you move back to a system that is running a conventional drive, and all of a sudden you're like, something has got to be wrong with this system, and it's not. It's just that you have adapted so quickly to the fact that your computer is actually working that much faster, but you forgot what it felt like to be on a system that had a conventional drive. And that has caught me more than once when somebody finally said, you have to give it a moment, to catch up to what you're doing. And I just didn't realize it. And so that's one of those things where you just really don't. You don't realize what is happening when those things start to do that. Now, Don, those aren't the only ones, but those are kind of the more advanced things that we're talking about. But there are other things that we can do, of course, that if we have systems like my laptop, though, Don, which on my laptop, it doesn't really give me the ability to go, all right, Don, I want to go ahead and put this right into my new laptop, because most of these laptops they're kind of saying, look, you don't upgrade, you just get a new laptop that has more capacity in them. And if they're not upgradable, well, how can you still expand the storage ability that you need? Well, that's when we can get into some different types of external storage that we can talk about briefly as well. So for example, most of us have probably seen something like this, which is another type of flash memory, just like what we were talking about here. But this one will generally connect to a USB port, which is kind of the universal type of connector that we'll have. And they'll be much smaller in their capacity size that we tend to have. So this one, for example, is 16 gigs versus the flash memory that I was showing you that had 250 gigs, okay? So you'll see stuff like this just about everywhere that's out there, and most of us buy these because they're fast, they're easy, they allow us to store a lot of information very quickly, but I don't have to break open my laptop to add additional storage. Now I simply plug it in when I need to, and then of course, you know, as I'm done with it, I make sure I safely eject it from the computer, and then I pull it out. If not, some of those things that Don was talking about, that with a physical drive, you can damage information. Well, the same thing with these. If you tend to unplug it in the middle of a cycle when it's trying to read something or write something, or usually write something to the drive, when you actually unplug it without letting the operating system know. So we want to make sure that we're careful with these things, but they are really handy, and they really gives us that idea of plugging in and adding additional capacity right away in terms of memory.
Now, a USB key like you're holding up there is pretty universal at this point. Like, a lot of people use those. A great way to share data between systems. They are pretty fast, and most systems support them. But it's not always supported by everybody. It's not always the best way to hand things off. And when we say they're fast, it's fast in comparison to some of the previous types of storage. So, Ronnie, can you show us some of the other types of external storage that people might encounter?
Sure. So let's go backward in time a little bit more, and this way we'll kind of do that as well. So let me go ahead and bring up the probably a little bit older, a little bit slower here at times. But, well, things like this, right? Optical storage is another one. Now, optical storages came along at this kind of unusual time as well, when hard drive space or capacities were at a premium and they were very expensive, but we needed more than just the ability to add in, like a couple of floppy disks, okay? So these, of course, also you can end up with an optical drive, and they will hold a certain capacity, and this one is actually printed, if I can kind of hold it up here on my, my left hand here, okay? This one will hold about 700 megabytes. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but in that day when it was actually at its height, that's a lot of information that it could store on a single disk. And then, of course, DVDs came along, and this one is about 4.7 gigabytes here, okay? So both of these, essentially, in their examples, even though they're kind of exactly identical in terms of the size, well, one has a greater capacity, which is this one right here, than this one that's available, but it requires then another type of drive that we can also access as well. So this is out there, and it's still available, and the unusual thing is you don't realize how much you need one of these until you actually go into a place which only has these things. Because it's strange, Don. There was one time where I went someplace and I said, I don't know how I connect to your system because you're not allowing me to use USB anymore. They're like, well, don't you have optical? I was like, no, I haven't used optical in like 3 years. I didn't even think about it anymore. But yeah, the technology tends to pass off, at least for me, so quickly. But yeah, these are another great way to store information, but they are a bit more fragile because you can scratch the back of these surfaces very easily and not be able to access the data on them anymore.
Yeah, the big advantage with them is simply that you write once and then it stays in a non-modifiable form, so you can show that files haven't been tampered with. But like you said, very few laptops have that kind of storage, and there are a lot of other types of external storage too that you may or may not have sockets for in your laptop. You may not even have them in your desktop. You might have to have an external reader. So one that pops into mind for me are like memory cards. Do you have any examples of a memory card?
Yeah, I have one example of an older memory card that we tend to find in certain devices. So for example, this is what we call a compact flash. Now, if you're saying, that looks almost familiar, the earliest digital cameras, Don, I think, had these types of storage devices too. This one's fairly small. It only holds 64 megabytes. So it's strange, since my 20 megabyte hard drive was like 9,000 times larger than this This thing held 3 times the size of that
Wait a
device I
minute,
was talking about.
your 20 megabyte hard drive was 9,000 times the size of a 64 megabyte
It felt
flash
like it. It felt that heavy. Okay,
Well,
this is just
questionable math aside.
right.
We can store quite a bit of data
Little
on there.
hyperbole.
These are actually still useful today, though,
Right.
in like industrial equipment, right?
Right. So where we tend to find something like this is for things like routers. Okay, is where we tend to find them, where they only have to store a small amount of information, and the operating system that makes those devices end up working. They're fairly industrious, like what Don was saying, and others. You can kind of move them around and not really have to worry about them too much. But at the same time, you'll probably find them in those applications. You don't tend to find them in like 40 gigabyte sizes or anything like that. But the very fact and nature is that you will still see some of this in those in equipment that's usually in a networking closet somewhere if you're running routers and stuff like that. So just kind of be aware that you'll end up seeing probably any of these that we've actually showed you.
All right, now, Ronnie, we've kind of been dropping hints here that we don't have CD drives in our computers, even USB ports, like the USB key you held up. I can't plug that into my laptop. I don't have the right port for it. So we have all this external storage that I can't hook up to my computer. What are people using instead of external storage like that today?
Well, what ends up happening, of course, is that once we get past that and we still need additional storage and we're not able to hook in something like that, you're going to hear the idea of pushing towards cloud storage or network connected storage. And cloud storage is where you end up going out to the internet and you find a service provider that says, hey, we provide storage for you in the cloud, and you pay a subscription for this, and then they give you access to, well, so much of their storage. Now, the neat thing about it, though, is that when you gain access to it, well, all you have to do is actually have one of 2 ways to do that. You can download an application that will allow you to make it look like you're directly connected to that storage. So it only looks like another device on your computer. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. And I will go ahead and bring this up and we'll show you. Okay. So for example, right here, I have a little icon that says DropBox, it says ITProTV, and all this stuff that we see right inside of here in the show notes folder. Well, this is stuff that I've been working on in the past 6 months or so, okay, which is fine. But this is not really, just on my hard drive. This is stored up inside that internet service provider's infrastructure. And if I go to that service provider's infrastructure, let me minimize that, then I can kind of show you like up here in the cloud. So you log in, and now on their website, I can go in and I can go into the, well, here it is. Here's our CompTIA IT Fundamentals. And now Don can also access, and you can see right here where certain files were created by Don. Here's one that's created by Nate, and there's a couple of them way down here at the bottom. I think that was created by me, and my name is not appearing in them because, oops, I kind of backed out of that somehow. But you kind of get the idea. Let me see if I can find that again. But this gives us this ability to not have to worry about the size of the storage that I have. I can have it all up inside of the cloud service provider and be able to gain access to it as well back on my machine without having to jump through a lot of hoops. And the additional thing that's nice about this is, unlike those drives where things can fail like what Don mentioned, okay, these things have the ability to have what we call versioning, which allows us to say if I accidentally delete it, I can probably bring that back as well. And if I overwrite something, oh, I shouldn't have overwritten that, I can go back and find that last version I had, and it also keeps track of that too.
Yeah, one of the things I really like here is that if I lose my USB key, because they're small,
Right.
they're removable, it's easy to lose them, I lose the data that's on them. But if I lose my entire laptop and I'm using cloud storage, I still have access to my data. It's in the cloud. I could have a hard drive failure. My house could burn down, and all of my data is
Right.
safely stored in the cloud. I don't really even have to worry about backups so much anymore. As long as I'm syncing my data up into the cloud, I know it's already stored somewhere else, and my data is safe, as long as we have those previous versions that are being
Right.
maintained as well. So that type of technology is really the way of the future. And right now, Ronnie, you're showing Dropbox. There's Microsoft OneDrive, Apple's iCloud Drive. There's Google Drive. There's tons of companies that are out there that are releasing cloud-based storage like this, and not just for individuals, but for entire companies, entire organizations that run entirely with cloud storage. So definitely the way of the future. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, there's no doubt because of exactly what you said. The very fact is, I don't even have to have my computer. If now I end up over at Don's house and I'm like, oh, I need to get access to that file, I just ask him if I can get access to Dropbox, and then I can go and find all the files that I've been syncing up there, and I can get access to them from there. So I don't even have to have that computer available to me, where we can actually do this stuff. So it's very much the wave of the future, and more than likely inside of most businesses, you're going to see a use like this because it's easier for them to keep track of everything in one location instead of actually going, well, hopefully Ronnie backed all that stuff up. You know, I don't really know because I realize he doesn't really like backing up stuff. If I make him sync to it, it's all going to be there, which is very nice too.
All right, well, Ronnie, I think that's a pretty good rundown of the different types of storage that are out there, the way storage is measured, and hopefully everybody out there in TV land has a better idea of how your computer is actually saving the data that you need to use, and is aware that there's a ton of different options out there. So before we wrap up, do you have any final comments for our viewers?
Well, just remember, right? Storage, you're probably going to see the one key aspect of what we want to make sure of course, is that you understand those different types. But remember, people always want more storage. So the more that you can afford to actually have, and you're probably going to actually help out whoever you're going to be supporting in that. But overall, though, just make sure you can understand the different types, and that will help you not only on the exam, but you'll also, of course, see them as you work in this industry.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up another episode for us here with CompTIA IT Fundamentals. Be sure to stay tuned, though, because we have more IT Fundamentals coming at you. And if you haven't checked it out, be sure to check out the ITProTV library. We have a lot of great IT learning in there available for you. You'll enjoy it. You can spend a lot of time hunting through content and finding great stuff. But definitely stay tuned. We have more IT Fundamentals coming down the line. Signing off for ITProTV, I'm Don Pezet.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.